At 0730, on July 24, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit stood in the conning tower of USS Tenosa. He looked through his periscope at a 19,000-ton Japanese tanker Tonin Maru No. 3. The ship was dead in the water, 2,000 yards away. Daspit had already fired 2 Mark 14 torpedoes in his first attack. The tanker was damaged, tilting to the right and not moving. There were no escort ships around. The sea was calm. The morning sun shone on the tanker's rusty hull. Daspit had plenty of time. This was the perfect kill, the kind that submarine commanders dreamed about. The target was sitting still. There was no hurry, no danger, just a broken ship waiting to sink. He moved Tenosa into the perfect firing position, side-on to the target at 875 yards. He was so close he could read the ship's name on the bow through the periscope. He could even count the portholes. This was point-blank range for a submarine attack. He told his crew to fire. The first torpedo left the tube. 30 seconds later, it hit the tanker with a loud clang that shook Tenosa. The crew could hear it clearly. Metal hit metal. No explosion. Daspit fired a second torpedo. Another clang. No explosion. He fired a third. Same result. A fourth. A fifth. A sixth. A seventh. An eighth. A ninth. A 10th, and 11th. Every torpedo hit exactly where Daspit aimed. The crew could hear each hit through the hull, clang, 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 like hammers hitting an anvil. Not one torpedo exploded. The crew in the torpedo room knew something was wrong. The fire control team knew something was wrong. Daspit knew something was wrong. But they kept firing. Maybe the next one would work. It didn't. Daspit had started with 16 torpedoes. His first 4 fired gave 2 hits that damaged the tanker. Then he fired 11 more, one at a time from a perfect position. 11 hits, 11 loud clangs, 11 duds. Not one exploded. The tanker stayed afloat, damaged, mocking them. Daspit had exactly 1 torpedo left. He saved it. He ordered Tenosa to surface and head to Pearl Harbor. He was taking proof back with him. Proof that American submarines were sent to fight with weapons that did not work. Daspit did not know that this failed attack would finally make the U.S. Navy admit what submarine crews had been yelling for 21 months. The Mark 14 torpedo was broken. And that broken weapon was killing American submariners while letting Japanese ships sail safely across the Pacific. This was not just a technical problem. It was a disaster. Hundreds of American lives were already lost. Thousands of Japanese ships that should have sunk were still on the ocean. By the end of 1943, American submariners fixed every major problem with their torpedoes, even though the people who designed them didn't want to admit there was a problem. Once the submarines had working torpedoes, they destroyed Japan's economy so badly that Japanese military leaders later said the submarine campaign was the main reason they lost the war. Meanwhile, Japanese submarines, even though they were some of the best in the world, did almost nothing. They had good submarines, they had torpedoes that worked, but they made very bad strategic choices, so their submarines did not matter to the war. The first American submarine commander to notice the Mark 14 torpedo was seriously broken was Lieutenant Commander Tyrell Jacobs of USS Sargo. On December 24, 1941, just 17 days after Pearl Harbor, Sargo fired 8 torpedoes at Japanese merchant ships. Jacobs heard the torpedoes hit the ships. He heard loud clangs through Sargo's sonar, but nothing exploded. The ships sailed away unharmed. Jacobs wrote a detailed report. He said clearly that the torpedoes hit the target but didn't go off. The Bureau of Ordnance looked at his report and said it was the crew's fault. The torpedoes were fine. Jacobs must have made mistakes. For the next 18 months, this became their standard answer. Submarine commanders reported torpedo failures. The Bureau blamed the commanders. Lieutenant Commander Richard Vogue on USS Sailfish fired 14 torpedoes at Japanese merchant ships in January 1942. He watched through the periscope as torpedo after torpedo ran under the ships without exploding. He also noticed that the torpedoes ran too deep, at least 10 feet deeper than they were set. The Bureau said the torpedoes were fine and the problem was poor attack setup. Other submarine commanders had similar problems. Lieutenant Commander Lewis Parks on USS Pompano attacked a Japanese freighter in January 1942. He fired 6 torpedoes from a perfect position. All 6 went under the target. The freighter sailed away. Parks reported that the torpedoes were too deep. The Bureau blamed his depth settings. Lieutenant Commander James Coe on USS Skipjack attacked the Japanese aircraft carrier on Christmas Day, less than 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor. He fired 4 torpedoes from close range. All 4 either missed or didn't explode. Coe later wrote that Japanese anti-submarine defenses were so weak that a submarine could almost chase ships up the bay, but his torpedoes still wouldn't sink them. By March 1942, submarine commanders all over the Pacific were reporting the same problems: torpedoes running too deep, torpedoes hitting targets but not exploding, and torpedoes exploding too early before reaching the targets. The patterns were the same on different submarines with different crews and different commanders, but the Bureau of Ordnance kept saying there was nothing wrong with the Mark 14 because the Bureau had designed it and the Bureau had tested it, and therefore it was correct, and any other evidence had to be wrong. The real problem was the depth control pressure sensor. When engineers increased the warhead weight during design, they never recalibrated the sensor, so the heavier warhead made the torpedo ride deeper in the water. This was not a small mistake. An 11-foot depth error meant torpedoes set to hit a destroyer keel would pass under the ship without touching it. It meant torpedoes aimed at the waterline of a merchant ship would run safely underneath. The fix was simple once the problem was found. Recalibrate the depth setting mechanism to match the heavier warhead, and they moved the pressure sensor to the middle of the torpedo where water pressure readings were more correct. By late 1942, the depth problem was fixed, but submarine commanders still reported failures. Now that torpedoes were hitting ships instead of running under them, a different problem became clear. Torpedoes were hitting targets and still not exploding. The Mark 14 used a Mark 6 exploder that had 2 triggers: a magnetic trigger that was supposed to sense the ship's magnetic field and explode under the keel, and a contact trigger that was supposed to explode when it hit the hull. The magnetic trigger was supposed to be new and amazing tech that would break a ship in half with one shot instead of needing 3 or 4, but it was failing in a big way. Lieutenant Commander John Scott on USS Tunney was in a perfect attack spot on April 9th. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers were in front of him, only 880 yards away, close enough for him to see planes on the decks. He fired all 10 torpedoes and aimed carefully. He heard 7 explosions, and for a moment the crew thought they had hits, but when Scott looked through the periscope, all 3 carriers were still moving fast with no damage at all. The explosions happened too early. Later, intelligence said all 7 torpedoes exploded before they reached the ships because the magnetic trigger sensed the carrier's magnetic field too soon. Early explosions did no damage and only warned the enemy that a submarine was close, and gave away the sub's position. It was worse than a miss, because a miss was silent, but a premature explosion told every destroyer exactly where to hunt. The magnetic trigger had 3 bad problems. First, Earth's magnetic field changes in different places. The Bureau tested the exploder near Rhode Island, but the Pacific magnetic field was different and caused early blasts or no blasts at all. Second, the magnetic trigger was sensing ships' magnetic fields too early, causing premature explosions like Tunney's that spring. Third, metal in the USS Tenosa was messing with the magnetic trigger, causing messy compass readings. If the metal in the submarine can mess with the magnetic trigger, what about the metal in the torpedo itself? The warhead of the torpedo had a lot of metal in it: iron, brass, and copper. The magnetic trigger was mounted right behind the warhead, so the metal in the warhead was causing the magnetic trigger to go wrong.
Was too sensitive, and even small changes in magnetic strength made it explode early. Third, the exploder had design flaws. Water leaked into the case and damaged electrical parts, and the small brush riggings that sent power to the magnetic sensor were weak and failed under battle use. Lockwood wanted to turn off the magnetic trigger right away, but needed higher approval. That approval came from Admiral Chester Nimitz on June 24, 1943. All submarines in the Pacific were ordered to shut off the magnetic trigger and use only the contact trigger. This fixed the early explosion issue, but showed the third big defect. The contact trigger was also broken. That is what Lawrence Daspit faced with Tunnan-Maru No. 3 on July 24, 1943. With the magnetic trigger off, his torpedoes should have exploded when they hit the tanker hull, but they did not. 9 perfect hits and 9 duds. Daspic brought Tenosa back to Pearl Harbor with 1 unexploded torpedo. He gave it to the base torpedo shop for checking. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood met Daspit at the submarine pier. Lockwood later wrote, "I expected a torrent of cuss words damning me, the Bureau of Ordnance, the Newport Torpedo Station, and the base torpedo shop." I could not have blamed him. 19,000-ton tankers do not grow on trees. I think Daspit was so angry he could hardly speak. Lockwood ordered immediate testing. The Pearl Harbor Torpedo Shop ran experiments. They fired torpedoes at underwater cliffs off Kahula Island. They dropped dummy warhead torpedoes from cranes onto steel plates at different angles. The test showed the problem. The contact trigger firing pin was badly designed. The pin was too heavy. When a torpedo hit a ship straight at 90 degrees perpendicular to the hull, the sudden stop caused forces over 500 Gs. That force bent the firing pin before it could hit the percussion cap. The pin jammed in its housing, and the warhead did not explode. The better the shot, the more likely it would fail. A glancing hit at an angle could work because the forces were smaller and spread over more time. But a perfect straight hit, which commanders were trained to make, would jam the pin and make a dud. American submarine rules told commanders to make perfect 90-degree shots from the side, which guaranteed the most duds. The torpedo shop took apart Daspit's unexploded torpedo. They found the firing pin bent and the housing damaged. The mechanism had failed from impact. Admiral Lockwood allowed immediate field changes. Pearl Harbor Torpedo Shop made a lighter, stronger firing pin. They built new pins from aluminum taken from Japanese aircraft propellers that had been shot down. Everyone noted the irony. By September 1943, all submarines leaving Pearl Harbor had torpedoes with the new firing pins. By November 1943, all 3 big defects were fixed. Depth control fixed, magnetic trigger turned off, contact trigger redesigned. For the first time since the war started, American submarines had torpedoes that worked. 21 months after Pearl Harbor, 21 months of sending submariners to war with weapons that did not work. 21 months of ships that should have sunk sailing away untouched. The man who made these fixes was Lockwood. He fought the Bureau of Ordnance at every step. He ran unauthorized tests when the Bureau refused to test. He wrote down every torpedo failure in detail. He collected patrol reports from dozens of submarine commanders about torpedo problems. He made statistics showing that American submarines were firing 10 torpedoes for every 1 confirmed sinking. That ratio should have been 3 to 1 at most. The torpedoes were the problem, not the submarine commanders. He let his commanders change their own torpedoes when official fixes were delayed. Some submarines turned off magnetic triggers on their own, breaking the rules because they knew the triggers did not work. Lockwood protected them. He did not court-martial anyone for changing torpedoes without permission. He kept his people safe from Bureau of Ordnance punishment. In early 1943, Lockwood flew to Washington to face Bureau officials directly. He walked into a conference room full of senior officers, many of whom had designed the Mark 14 and did not want to admit it was broken. Lockwood showed his proof, test results, patrol reports, and statistics. He showed that the magnetic trigger did not work reliably. He showed that submarines were hitting ships but not sinking them. He demanded action. The Bureau officials got defensive. They said Lockwood's commanders were not taking care of the torpedoes. They said the magnetic triggers were being damaged by rough handling. They said everything except that their design could be wrong. Lockwood lost his temper. He told them if the Bureau of Ordnance could not give us torpedoes that would hit and explode or even a gun bigger than a pea shooter, then for God's sake get the Bureau of Ships to design a boat hook so we could rip the plates off a ship's side. The room went silent. Nobody had talked to the Bureau like that. But Lockwood didn't care about rules. He cared about his submariners. He was sending men to war with broken weapons, and the bureaucrats who made them were more worried about covering mistakes than fixing them. Lockwood made it clear he would not leave Washington until something was done. He had Admiral Nimitz's support, he had proof, and he would not back down. Lockwood also did something else that mattered. He removed submarine commanders who were not aggressive enough. In the first year of the war, many American submarine captains were cautious, following pre-war rules that said avoid risk. They would make one attack, fire torpedoes from far away, and then pull back whether they hit or not. This was normal from peacetime training, but it did not sink ships. Lockwood picked the aggressive commanders and promoted them. He gave them the best submarines and the best missions. Men like Dudley Morton on Oahu, Richard O'Kane, Samuel Dealey, and Eugene Fluckey. These were the commanders who made American submarines famous. Morton on Oahu made a new tactic where his executive officer used the periscope during attacks while Morton handled the whole battle. This let Morton watch sonar, radar, lookouts, and the periscope at the same time. He could make better choices because he was not only watching one thing. Other commanders copied this. Samuel Dealey on USS Harder became known for hunting destroyers instead of merchant ships. Destroyers were fast, armed, and dangerous. Most submarine captains avoided them, but Dealey attacked them on purpose. In May 1944, Harder sank 3 destroyers in 4 days. In June, Harder sank 2 more destroyers in 2 days. Dealey showed that aggressive submarines could defeat the hunters who were supposed to hunt submarines. Harder was lost with all crew in August 1944, but Dealey showed what bold leadership could do. Eugene Fluckey on USS Barb went even further. In January 1945, Barb entered Nandawa Armor in China, attacked a Japanese convoy at anchor, and escaped under fire. In July 1945, Barb carried the only ground combat mission by American submarine men in World War II, landing a demolition team on the Japanese coast to blow up a railroad. Fluckey finished the war with the Medal of Honor, 4 Navy Crosses, and a reputation as one of the boldest submarine commanders in history. These aggressive commanders proved that American submarines could control the Pacific if they had working weapons and were not held back by cautious rules. Lockwood gave them the weapons, gave them the freedom to fight, and stepped back to let them win. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton took command of USS Oahu on December 31, 1942. Before his first patrol, he made a speech to the crew. He said Oahu was expendable, and any crew member who wanted to stay in Brisbane had 30 minutes to request a transfer. There would be no penalty for staying behind. Not one crew member left. They all wanted to sail with Morton. Morton's third patrol in January 1943 became famous. He took Oahu into Wewak Harbor on the north coast of New Guinea. There were no maps of the harbor. One crew member had bought a cheap atlas in Australia showing Wewak as a small indentation on the coast. Using that atlas, Oahu navigated into enemy waters. He found a Japanese destroyer with several submarines nearby. Morton fired 3 torpedoes at the destroyer from 1,200 yards. All 3 missed or failed. The destroyer saw Oahu and turned to attack. He could see it through the periscope. The destroyer was charging fast straight at him. Any normal commander would have gone deep and escaped. Morton waited. He let the destroyer come close. When it was near enough that a collision seemed likely, Morton fired another torpedo straight at the destroyer. The torpedo hit in the middle and broke it in half. The destroyer sank in minutes. 2 days later, Oahu found a 5-ship convoy north of New Guinea. Morton attacked on the surface in daylight in a battle that lasted 14 hours. He sank the transport Buyo Maru, carrying over 1,000 Japanese soldiers. He sank the freighter Fukumaru and damaged other ships. Then he surfaced and destroyed lifeboats with the deck gun to prevent survivors from reporting Oahu's location. It was brutal, aggressive fighting. Oahu returned to Pearl Harbor on February.
The silent service stopped being silent. American submarines went on the attack. By late 1943, when torpedoes were fixed, American submarines had the weapons, the tactics, and the commanders to conduct unrestricted submarine warfare. The results were terrible for Japan. In 1942, with broken torpedoes and cautious tactics, submarines sank 109 Japanese ships, totaling 640,000 tons. It was a small start, slowed by torpedo failures and commanders learning how to fight. Many submarine captains followed pre-war rules that said be cautious. They would approach a target, fire torpedoes from far away, then immediately retreat to avoid counterattack. This was safe, but did not work. Torpedoes fired from 3,000 yards could fail during the run. Targets had time to escape. And if the torpedoes ran deep or did not explode, long-range shots hid the problems. In 1943, things changed. The depth problem was fixed. By summer, the magnetic trigger was turned off. Bold commanders like Morton showed what could be done. Submarines sank more than 1.5 million tons that year. That was more than twice the previous year's total. But torpedo problems still hurt the force. The contact trigger was not fixed until September. Many submarines were still using torpedoes with bad firing pins. They were hitting ships, but not sinking them. In 1944, everything came together. Torpedoes worked, commanders were bold, tactics improved. Submarines sank over 3 million tons that year, double 1943. American submarines operated close to Japanese home islands. They went into the Sea of Japan. They hunted in wolf packs. They destroyed Japanese shipping. By early 1945, Japan's merchant ships were almost gone. There were too few targets left. Submarines struggled to find ships to sink. American submarines sank 1,314 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5.3 million tons. That was 55% of all Japanese shipping losses in the war. Submarines also sank 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 15 cruisers, and 42 destroyers. The economic effect was terrible for Japan. The Japanese home islands had almost no natural resources. Japan imported 90% of its oil. It imported all its rubber. It imported 88% of its iron ore. It imported huge amounts of food, everything needed for war. Oil from the East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore from China and Manchuria, food from Korea and Taiwan had to be shipped by sea. The merchant fleet was Japan's economic lifeline. American submarines cut that lifeline. By mid-1944, oil tankers were sunk faster than Japan could replace them. Refineries closed for lack of crude oil. Without fuel, planes stayed on the ground. Training flights stopped. Combat flights decreased. Warships stayed in port because there was no fuel. The super battleship Yamato spent most of 1944 tied to a pier because it did not have enough oil. When Yamato finally left for its suicide mission to Okinawa in April 1945, it had only enough fuel for a one-way trip. There was not enough fuel in Japan for a return. Industry collapsed. Factories needed raw materials. Ships carrying iron ore, coal, bauxite, and copper were at the bottom of the Pacific. Aircraft production dropped. Ship production dropped. Ammunition production dropped. The Japanese economy was starving, not because of bombing, not because of combat losses, but because American submarines destroyed the merchant fleet that kept the economy alive. Japan's government said after the war that losing shipping was the biggest reason they lost. Not atomic bombs, not island invasions, not strategic bombing, but the loss of their merchant fleet. American submarines did that while being less than 2% of the U.S. Navy, but the cost was high. 52 American submarines were lost during the war. 356 submariners died. That was a 22% death rate, the highest of any branch of the American military. 1 in 5 submariners who went to war did not come home. By comparison, the overall U.S. military death rate was about 3%. Submariners died at 7 times that rate. The losses happened all through the war. Some submarines vanished with no trace, thought to be sunk by mines or depth charges with no survivors. Some were sunk in known battles, going down while fighting. USS Grunion was possibly sunk by one of its own defective torpedoes that came back.
USS Tang was definitely sunk by one of her own torpedoes. USS Wahoo was hunted and destroyed in La Perouse Strait. Each loss meant 60 to 80 men dead. The submariners knew the risks. They volunteered for submarine duty, knowing the death rates. They went on patrol knowing they might never return. They kept fighting even with broken torpedoes, even with losses, even knowing their own weapons could kill them. And they won. They strangled Japan's economy. They cut the supply lines that kept Japan's war machine working. They achieved results that shortened the war and saved hundreds of thousands of lives, American and Japanese. The cost was high, but without an effective submarine campaign, the war would have been much worse. Meanwhile, the Imperial Japanese Navy had the most advanced submarine force in the world. Japan built submarines bigger than anything America made. The I-400 class submarines displaced 6,500 tons underwater, carried 3 bomber planes in a watertight hangar, and could sail 37,000 miles. They could go from Japan to the American West Coast, attack, and return without refueling. Japan built submarines capable of 23 knots on the surface, faster than any American boat. Japan built human torpedo submarines called Kaiten, supply submarines and reconnaissance submarines. By 1945, Japan had built all 39 of the world's diesel-electric submarines with more than 10,000 horsepower. Japan had the technology, excellent boats, skilled crews, and torpedoes that worked from day one. But they did almost nothing. Japanese submarines sank 2 American aircraft carriers in 1942. I-19 sank USS Wasp on September 15th. The same torpedo salvo also hit the battleship USS North Carolina, tearing a 32-foot hole in her hull. I-168 sank USS Yorktown on June 7th after the Battle of Midway. These were big victories, but isolated, not part of a long campaign. Japanese submarines damaged battleship North Carolina. They sank the cruiser USS Indianapolis in 1945. Total Japanese submarine sinkings for the whole war were about 184 merchant ships of about 1 million gross registered tons. Compare that to German U-boats, which sank 2,840 ships of 14.3 million tons, or American submarines, 1,314 ships of 5.3 million tons, or even British submarines, 593 ships of 1.52 million tons. Japanese submarines could have matched or exceeded those totals. They failed because their strategic choices were completely wrong. Japanese naval strategy focused on one big battle, like the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where the Japanese fleet destroyed the Russian Baltic fleet in a single fight. Japanese planners thought any future war would be the same. They wanted to lure the American fleet across the Pacific, harass it with submarines and air attacks, then destroy it in a big battle with battleships and carriers. Japanese submarines were made to support that plan. Their main job was to scout for American task forces, follow them, and attack warships, not sink merchant ships. This made sense tactically, but failed strategically. American fleets were fast, could move, and had strong defenses. Attacking a carrier task force meant getting past destroyers with sonar and depth charges, avoiding patrol planes with radar, and then trying to hit carriers that could go 30 knots with many escorts. Even if Japanese submarines succeeded, the risk was huge. Many were lost. Attacking merchant ships would have worked much better. Merchant ships were slow, usually 10 to 12 knots. They had little protection and often sailed alone early in the war. They were very important to Allied logistics. Each merchant ship carried fuel, food, ammo, and equipment. Sinking them slowed operations, delayed invasions, and forced Allies to protect convoys. A full attack on American supply lines across the Pacific would have stretched defenses. Distances were huge. San Francisco to Pearl Harbor was 2,400 miles. Pearl Harbor to Australia was 4,700 miles. Pearl Harbor to the Philippines was 5,000 miles. These supply lines were weak. Japanese submarines had the range and endurance to attack them. But Japanese leaders never changed strategy. They kept sending submarines after warships, even as the situation got worse. Worse, as Japan lost land and isolated islands needed supplies, submarines were used to deliver food and ammo. By 1943, Japanese submarines were carrying supplies to bypassed islands. Torpedoes were removed from tubes. Weapons were taken off to make space. Cargo containers were welded to hulls. Combat submarines became glorified freighters, carrying rice and bullets instead of attacking enemy ships. These supply missions were suicide. Submarines would surface near island beaches at night to unload. They were vulnerable, slow on the surface, and defenseless against air attacks. American planes and patrol boats hunted them non-stop. Losses were high. Dozens of submarines were lost delivering supplies that could have been carried more easily by fast destroyers or special cargo ships. The Army demanded submarine support. The Navy agreed, and combat submarines were wasted on jobs they were not made for. Skilled crews and value a boat.
The losses were terrible. Dozens of submarines were lost while carrying supplies that could have been delivered more easily by fast destroyers or specially made cargo submarines. But the Army demanded submarine help. The Navy agreed, and combat submarines were wasted on jobs they were never built for. Captain Atsushi Oi, a staff officer in Japan's Grand Escort Command, later wrote about Japan's anti-submarine failures. He said plainly, Japan failed in anti-submarine warfare, mostly because the Navy ignored the problem. Japan had no single command to protect merchant ships until November 1943. By then, the submarine war was already lost. Even after making the Grand Escort Command, they didn't have enough resources. Japan built destroyers for big fleet battles, fast and heavily armed, but never built cheap, mass-produced escort destroyers for convoy work. Britain and America built hundreds of escort destroyers for anti-submarine work. Japan never did. Japanese anti-submarine tactics were also weak. Depth charges were set too shallow. Congressman Andrew May pointed this out in 1943, and Japan adjusted the depth settings. But even then, Japanese depth charges were not strong enough. Japanese destroyers didn't have sonar or radar like Allied escorts. They couldn't find submarines reliably or attack effectively. Japanese naval planes also failed to make good anti-submarine tactics. American patrol planes sank many Japanese submarines. Japanese planes rarely sank American submarines. There was a cultural problem. The Japanese Navy focused on attack, not defense. Battleships and carriers were prestigious. Escort duty was not. Anti-submarine work was seen as boring, defensive, and bad for career advancement. The best officers and newest ships went to strike forces. Convoy protection got leftovers. This problem wasn't only in Japan. Britain had it in World War I and early World War II. But Britain learned, adapted, and built an effective convoy system. Japan never changed. By mid-1944, Japan's shipping was in disaster. Oil imports dropped from 1.8 million tons in 1943 to 300,000 tons in 1944. Rice from Korea and Taiwan fell by 70%. Iron ore from China was almost gone. Factories stopped. Civilians went hungry. The military couldn't move troops or supplies. American submarines were slowly killing Japan. Japanese submarines did nothing to stop it. There was one case where Japanese submarines caused heavy losses. USS Indianapolis was torpedoed and sunk by I-58 on July 30, 1945. 879 sailors died, most from sharks and exposure, over 4 days before rescue. Indianapolis had just delivered parts for the atomic bomb to Tinian. The sinking was tragic, but by then, one cruiser did not matter strategically. Japan had already lost. The war ended 2 weeks later. Admiral Charles Lockwood retired from the Navy in 1947. He served 35 years, most of them in submarines. He wrote several books about submarine warfare, including Silent Service, published in 1951. He always stood up for his submariners and made sure their achievements were recognized. He died on June 6, 1967, at age 77. He was buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in California, alongside Admirals Chester Nimitz,
Raymond Spruance, and Richmond Kelly Turner. Lawrence Daspit, who brought Tenosa back with one torpedo after the Tonon-Morrell attack, kept commanding submarines. He made 4 more war patrols, sinking many Japanese ships. He survived the war, continued in the Navy, and retired as a Rear Admiral in 1962. He died in 1998 at age 87. The torpedo he saved from the Tonon-Morrell attack was crucial in proving the contact trigger defect. That one torpedo gave Lockwood the evidence needed to force the Bureau of Ordnance to fix the problem. Dudley Morton continued his aggressive tactics. He made 4 more patrols as Wahoo's commander, sinking ships on every patrol. His 4th patrol in March 1943 in the shallow Yellow Sea became legendary. In 10 days, Wahoo sank 7 ships and damaged another. Morton's 5th patrol began in late April 1943 and was just as successful. He fired 10 torpedo attacks in 10 days, sinking multiple ships despite torpedo malfunctions. Morton's 7th patrol began on September 9, 1943. Wahoo was ordered to go into the Sea of Japan through La Perouse Strait. The submarine was never heard from again. Japanese records later showed Wahoo was attacked by anti-submarine aircraft on October 11, 1943 in La Perouse Strait. All 80 officers and crew were lost. Morton was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. Wahoo received 6 battle stars and a Presidential Unit Citation. Morton finished the war with 19 ships sunk, about 50,000 tons. He was one of the top 3 American submarine commanders of the war. Richard O'Kane, Morton's executive officer on Wahoo, went on to command USS Tang. He sank 33 ships for 116,450 tons, the highest total of any American submarine commander. Tang was later sunk by one of her own torpedoes that ran in a circle on her final patrol. O'Kane survived, spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, and received the Medal of Honor after the war. He died in 1994 at age 83. The lessons from the submarine war are very clear. Technical skill alone means nothing without the right strategy. Japanese submarines were better than American submarines in many ways. They were bigger, faster, had longer range, and carried more torpedoes. Their torpedoes worked from the start, but they attacked the wrong targets. They were used for supply missions instead of real combat. They were never used in a coordinated plan against merchant shipping. American submarines had broken torpedoes for 21 months. But once the torpedoes worked, American submarines had the right strategy, bold commanders, and an unrelenting focus on cutting off Japan's economy. The results speak for themselves. American submarines sank 55% of Japanese shipping. Japanese submarines did almost nothing of real strategic value. Another lesson is about institutions. The Bureau of Ordnance refused to believe anything was wrong with the Mark 14 torpedo. They ignored submarine commanders' reports. They blamed crews for torpedo failures. They resisted testing. They delayed repairs. It took a commander like Lockwood, who was willing to bypass the Bureau, run unauthorized tests, and fight bureaucracy at every step to get the torpedoes fixed. If Lockwood had been less determined, if he had accepted the Bureau's assurances that everything was fine, American submariners would have kept fighting with defective weapons the entire war. More lives would have been lost. The war's impact would have been much smaller. Sometimes the biggest victories come from fixing problems nobody wants to admit exist. That's what happened in the Pacific Submarine War. American submariners knew their torpedoes were broken. Lockwood believed them and worked to fix the problems. Once they had working weapons, nothing could stop them. Meanwhile, Japanese submarines had all the technology and hardware they needed, but not the right strategy. Technology alone does not win wars. Strategy and determination win wars. If you found this story interesting, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each story matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans the world and connects people who understand that history's lessons are still important today. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.